on the places you visit. Anywhere we go on the globe. And there are places in the world that are called over touristed. I don't know if any of you have heard of that term. I've been hearing about it for a long time. The great travel expert Rick Steves has been accused of creating over touristed spots in the world because he highlights them, especially places that no one knew about before Rick Steves mentioned it. But there are lots of places in the world. I was trying to find an article I had from the Washington Post about 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, I forget, about over touristed places in the world. And they gave you alternatives to every one of those over touristed places that you could go. And an example of that is a place like Cinque Terre in Italy. It was actually kind of unknown a couple of decades ago, and now it's one of these places that people are packed. And an over touristed place, besides having too many people, also finds that the tourists leave a negative impact. That negative impact could simply be straining local resources, generating trash, all sorts of things like that. But they also can make a place kind of unwelcoming for locals to live there. And one of the curious things that happened during the pandemic, when a lot of cities in the world that were considered over touristed, for example, Amsterdam or Prague are two cities considered over touristed. When people stopped coming, the locals rediscovered their communities, and some of them are having a hard time letting the tourists back in. This is ironic because a lot of places in the world depend heavily on tourists for their economy. And so I've been reading some articles about how those two cities in particular are struggling to figure out how they can keep the character they feel they've regained during the pandemic without giving up on tourists. So I don't know what their answer is because I think neither of them has reached, neither Amsterdam nor Prague, for example, have reached the numbers of tourists that they used to have. But we'll see what they approach it. Another scene you all might remember, if any of you have been to Rome, you know how absolutely packed with people Rome can be. And I have a letter from my father that he wrote home from his trip to Rome in 1965. And he mentioned in October of 1965 how crowded Rome was with tourists. So that's nothing new. But I don't know if anybody else saw the pictures of Rome with like no people on the streets. And then they slowly opened it back up to locals, and the locals just loved their city. And some of them said, I still like tourists. I still like seeing people around. But anyway, that's something that a lot of places that are kind of over touristed already were coming to grips with. And, another thing that adds to
Russ,
that.
I was just going to say, didn't we, it's not overseas, but aren't they, or have they, before all the fires in and around Tahoe, were they making it harder and harder for tourists to come to parts of, I don't know whether it was all of Tahoe, but parts of Tahoe where they were restricting as many tourists as they could because they just didn't want any more?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that one. Anybody else out there know that? Fred, you're from California.
All I do know is that Lake Tahoe, part of Lake Tahoe is in Nevada where gambling is legal. So you have one part of Tahoe has casinos and things like that. So that may be part of over tourist issue.
Yeah, I don't know whether they didn't specifically say about gambling, but they were talking about restricting parking. You can only park for so long. They would tow your car. I mean, they were making it to where it was an ongoing thing, and it just kept getting worse. And finally, the city fathers decided they were going to take steps to try to reduce it. So it's not, it may be a worldwide issue, not necessarily just overseas. It may be here as well.
Well, That's a good question, Greg. And by the way, I want to share with others that please feel free to ask questions, or you can also put questions in chat. You can put comments in the chat. I like to pause and ask for comments. This is a serious issue about over tourism. And it's not to say we shouldn't be traveling, because I think travel has huge benefits. But we should all be in mind. I mean, we have a class tonight on Venice, and it's fun. So if you come back at 7:30, we'll do. You can see the class on Venice, and a lot of it is actually the Rick Steves video, because he did an excellent video on helps you understand what Venice really is. And I've never wanted to go there because I knew it was one of the world's over touristed place. However, after watching Rick Steves and listening to some others of you, we have several. They're not in this class today, but we have several regulars to travel classes who love Venice, and Rick Steves and these others have told you how to avoid the crowds on Venice. So you can go see the city and not suffer the fate of being crushed with crowds. So so I've given you an example, 3 or 4 places: the Cinque Terre, Venice, Prague, and Amsterdam. That's all over touristy places. Nancy, did you have a question or comment?
No, I was just thinking there's also a lot of nature trails, hiking trails that are extremely over touristed, and people not taking care properly of the trails. My husband and I hiked to Machu Picchu one year, and they no longer allow individuals to go on their own because of that the terrible impact on the trails there, so they limit the number of on any given day how many people can go on the trail. I think that's not unique either.
No, it's not.
I think you're probably gonna mention, I think Venice is talking about a daily quota or some restriction, or
no, I have heard that. I have heard that. I was going to respond to Nancy because Machu Picchu is one of those places that's considered over touristed.
Yep.
And there are parks and places which are considered over touristed. And what Fred said is correct. Some of these places are looking at ways to limit. Some of us might know that the U.S. national parks this summer got over touristed, and some of them started limiting admission entrance, and you had to get, even though it's free, if you have a pass, you still had to get a prior entrance to them. So I'm happy to say some of the places around here that are our national park, Shendo National Park, is not over touristed yet, but what Nancy said is right. A lot of them, I lived out west for 5 years, lived in Idaho, and it's easy to think of places in the West, for example, as just kind of wide open. There's nothing there. And it's actually a very fragile ecosystem. And they don't want people trampling or riding or biking or four-wheeling across some of this area, because it's very fragile and they can destroy it easily. So this is a hot topic, and I expect that there to be more discussion in places of the world that have rediscovered